Okay, thank you. Thanks, sepideh, for the invitation. So what I'm going to do today is simply present, in a way, summarize, the main claims of the chapter which you've read, which appeared a couple of years ago. But this, in a way, this discussion of Deleuze and Guattari deals with topics which I'm very interested in, and especially the relationship between critiques of representation, philosophies that kind of reject the representational paradigm, and philosophies of practice, or philosophies which connect thinking and practice. And it's this aspect of A Thousand Plateaus that I'm focusing on in particular. So the basic question is, what is the relationship between the abstract and the concrete? Expressed in the title of this final concluding plateau of the book. How do rules relate to machines? And what I want to do is to try to clarify the parameters within which Deleuze and Guattari's book operates in an attempt to answer these questions. So if Deleuze and Guattari are materialists, or if they kind of lay claim to materialism, then it's neither a contemplative representation of an objectively existing material reality, but nor does it consist of a series of practical imperatives that presuppose yet disavow a theoretical representation of material reality. So in other words, if this is a materialism beyond representation, then the sense in which the thinking carried out in the book relates to the real, or relates to materiality, has to be, can't be accounted for in terms of familiar characterizations of philosophical materialism. Okay, and it's not a claim about, it doesn't simply identify being with matter in a kind of traditional pre-Kantian register, and nor is it simply about the practice entailed by this commitment to materialism. Isn't about simply living in accordance with a characterization of reality. And in this regard, for all its idiosyncratic novelty, A Thousand Plateaus conforms to a classical model of philosophizing, where an ontology understood as the account of what there is one with ethics understood as a practice or art of living. It's not to say that it's a traditional or conservative work, rather it's a contemporary reactivation of the classical task of philosophizing after the critique of representation. And what are the stakes of this reactivation? It fuses an account of abstract matter. This is what is the kind of one of the kind of the principal contentions of the book, wherein matter is conceived independently of form. So matter is abstract in the sense that it is not subsumed by form, by intelligible form. And this abstract matter is conjoined with a concrete ethics, where action is selected independently of universal law. So how can concrete practices engage formless matter? This is another way of asking about the nature of the distinction between the abstract and the concrete. So again, abstract, I think, in this context must be understood as unformed. But the unformed is endowed with positive traits of its own. Thus, abstract matter is described as constituting a plane of consistency characterized by continuums of intensities, particle signs, and deterritorialized flows. And this tripart positive characterization of abstract matter is consistent throughout the book. It's across all the it's an invariant across all the plateaus of the book. Intensities, particle signs, deterritorialized flows. It's the articulation of these three facets of abstract matter that is, that constitutes, the characters, the positive character of what they call the machinic, or assemblage, or assemblage understood as a kind of as an activity, assembling. And this is why they say that the plane of consistency must be mon plateau, which opens the book. They say it's not simply enough to kind of affirm the multiple, and denounce the one, or unity or identity. That affirmation remains empty unless the multiple is effectuated in a thinking doing that is not simply a kind of that doesn't presuppose a representational concordance between thought and reality. So if the multiple must be made, consistency is not attained through abstraction, but by what they call diagramming, what is most concrete in both thinking and doing. And concrete here means, I think, means practical. So recognizing and releasing the positive traits characteristic of the unformed is a practical matter, but one that is constrained by certain rules. What are these rules? Because real or abstract matter cannot be represented within material reality, the rules or injunctions governing the construction of the real cannot be read off some pre-existing reality. These rules will be concrete precisely to the extent that they effectuate the abstract. And in this sense, practice and theory, or thinking and doing, realize one another. Theoretical concepts are effectuated in practice, and practical imperatives are formulated in theory. So this project is a radicalization of philosophical pragmatics, wherein neither the agents nor the function of practices can be taken for granted. Thus, the reference of the communal we, regularly invoked by traditional pragmatists or neo-pragmatists such as Rorty, is a starting point whose epistemic authority and socio-historical coordinates will be gradually disassembled and replaced by another we, that of what Deleuze calls a minoritarian people to come. By the same token, the habitual functions and goals established around this existing we need to be suspended. Normal functioning and established finalities need to be disrupted. And this is why, again, just to emphasize, this is what is peculiarly novel about this account of, or this articulation of thinking and practice proposed by Deleuze and Guattari. It's that what it is that is being done cannot be, cannot be predetermined by a representation. So in other words, the modalities of doing are not representable in advance, okay, and cannot be specified by some kind of, paradigmatic representation of reality and of the possibilities of doing coextensive with that. Okay, so it'll be immediately achieved. Okay, since according to this, familiar Deleuzian injunction, we always start in the middle. We start stratified, organized, subjectified, and the practical challenge is to understand how destratification, disorganization, and desubjectification are possible, but without relapsing into religious self-abnegation. as they put it, to reach the point not where one no longer says I, but the point where it is no longer of any importance whether or not one says I. This is also important. The point is simply not to, again, the commitment to immanence, to this non-representational immanence of thinking and doing, means that if the familiar representation of the world is conditioned by these processes of stratification, organization, and subjectification, the point is not simply to, you can't leap out of these material processes. The constraints of stratification, organization, and subjectification cannot simply be bypassed or transcended. They have to be worked through. So the point is to find some kind of practical leverage which allows one to to destratify, disorganize, and desubjectify through in a rule-governed manner, immanently rather than transcendently. And this is why, again, this is a kind of a familiar, a familiar concern in Deleuze. This is why, the faithfulness to the immanence of the world, as Deleuze puts it, if philosophy is to be this worldly, then it cannot simply disavow, stratification, organization, and subjectification as, pathological deformations of some true or ultimate materiality of reality. That would still be a kind of a two-world. That would still, that would be to regress to the invocation of a world behind the scenes, which is a characteristic of the ascetic ideal and of metaphysical asceticism as denounced by Nietzsche. So the plane of immanence, whatever it is, isn't simply what lies beyond stratification, organization, etc. It has to be kind of effectuated through the constraints of formation, organization, signification, etc. Okay. And this is where the concrete rules come in. But why would this point of apparent indifference between owning or abnegating one's subjectivity be worth reaching? If such a point is worth reaching, it cannot be indifferent to this difference. Okay, the difference between stratification and destratification, or or formal function and non-formal functioning in the vocabulary of the book, has to be specifiable, using the accounts of the characterization of structure, form, etc., positively, cataloged in all the preceding chapters of the book. So something must be retained, something of the subject, something of the sign, something of the organism. And this is a quote actually from early on I think it's from the second, I'm not sure, but it's from the second, either the first or second Plateau. They write, that which races or dances upon the plane of consistency thus carries with it the aura of its stratum, an undulation, a memory or tension. The plane of consistency retains just enough of the strata to extract from them variables that operate in the plane of consistency as its own functions. And what will be retained on the plane of consistency is the torsion of destratified intensities, particles, signs, and flows. But because the point of torsion is indiscernible from the vantage of anyone invested in the importance of the distinction between self and not self, or personal and impersonal, its approach requires caution, which is one of the book's famous watchwords, which is, repeated, at several crucial junctures in the book. Caution is required for the composition of the plane of consistency. And this is the relevance of concrete rules for its composition. To understand how concrete rules are articulated with abstract machines, we have to understand how the composition of consistency, according to rules, requires deformalizing stratified functions and subjecting them to the torsion of absolute movement. And this is Deleuze and Guattari's definition of absolute movement. A movement is absolute when, whatever its quantity and speed, it relates a body considered as multiple to a smooth space that it occupies in the manner of a vortex. This is why the idea of the torque of a vortex is their positive qualitative characterization of absolute movement. Absolute movement is attained through the deformalization of stratified function. And deformalization ensures the continuity of intensities, the emission of particle signs, and the combination or conjunction of deterritorialized flows on the plane of consistency. Again, there's a great consistency to the vocabulary. There's a technical vocabulary that's used in a very kind of precise manner throughout the book. Intensive continuity, semiotic, emission, and the combination or conjunction of flows. These are, again, they use the same words all the time. Thus, abstract means de or unformed, which I think ultimately means destratified. So that stratification then becomes the source of all formalization. And this is why understanding the role of the account of stratification is crucial to understanding how the construction of the plane of consistency. What is stratification? I mean, very simply, before I go through, I kind of, reiterate or I paraphrase their account. I mean, I think, or the way I understand it is that when they say they called kind of the strata the judgments of God, and when they say that, I think what they're saying is that ideal synthesis, as formulated in Kant's critical philosophy, the synthesis of concepts and intuitions, through which the object of knowledge is constructed in Kant's critical philosophy, is conditioned by a real synthesis. And stratification is a synthetic operation which is a condition for the representability of reality. So I think that's the role. So stratification is a material phenomenon which unfolds at the physical, biological, and ultimately kind of, anthropomorphic levels. And it's the condition for, the representational kind of characterization of, of knowledge and practice, or in ethics. But here's a more detailed kind of paraphrase of their account. Stratification, this double articulation is the condition of all order, structure, and regularity. So it's complex. Both the articulation of content and that of expression are bifurcated. At the elementary physical level, content is articulated by splitting material flows into successively coordinated molecular units thus molecular substance is formally coordinated. This is what they call the substance and form of content. Expression, by way of contrast, is articulated by establishing compact, stable structures and constructing molar compounds onto which these structures are superimposed. Thus, molar compounds are formally structured, and this is the substance and form of expression. So that this double articulation of content and expression is the fundamental aspect of stratic synthesis, or real synthesis. Synthesis in the real, not in the ideal. So stratified content is formed matter, and stratified expression is structured function. And both these articulations are segmented such that what they call the bi-univocal relations between segments of content, or formed matters, and segments of expressions or structured functions are the source of every real structure, whether physical, biological, or socio-political. And thus, material reality comprises three fundamental types of strata: the physical, chemical, the biological, and the anthropomorphic or allomorphic. Allomorphic, I think, because the anthropomorphic strata have the power to colonize the others. Only the first of these gives a molar expression to molecular content. Consequently, biological and allomorphic contents are not necessarily molecular, and their expressions are not necessarily molar. Okay, it's easy. I don't want to kind of, the terminology can become, oppressive. But there's another kind of key aspect of the process of stratification, in that it's a process of division. So what they write, that strata shatter the continuums of intensity, introducing breaks between different strata and within each stratum. So now the paradox of it is that stratification is both, it's a splitting of, what they call continuums of intensity, or flows of matter energy, if you want to put it that way, which then institutes, a synthesis. So in other words, strata kind of, split, flows of intensity, and then institute, synthetic relations between, form and content, on the basis of this, originally splitting. And this division is real, not ideal, as they keep on insisting. In other words, it's not dialectical. So strata both split and segment, but they also conjoin and connect. And as I've already said, they insist, Deleuze and Guattari insist on the real as opposed to formal distinction between content and expression. So stratification is a real synthesis, establishing a common root for expressive form and expressed content. So consequently, there is an isomorphism between content and expression. And quote, their independence does not preclude isomorphism. In other words, the existence of the same kind of constant relations on both sides. And it's this isomorphism which makes a stratification of divine judgment, ontological as opposed to cognitive synthesis. Indeed, the significance of the doctrine of synthetic judgment, they write, is to have demonstrated that there is an a priori link, which I here take to mean isomorphism, between sentence and figure, or the form of expression and the form of content. Thus, real distinction, reciprocal presupposition, and isomorphy are the characteristics of stratic synthesis. Okay, so given this account, what follows from this account of in a way, the logic of stratification? It's that the alternative to stratic synthesis is not analysis, which would be the formal disintegration of the abstract and the concrete. The alternative, rather, is another kind of synthesis, which is to say, an alternative intrication of the abstract and the concrete. But this synthesis is not cognitive, but practical. Okay, and I think this is what they mean when they talk about the making of the multiple, or the construction of the multiple, as consisting of the diagramming, diagramming as opposed to to representing, of the junction between non-formal functions and unformed matters. So here's another quote. This is a lengthy quote, but so what they call abstract machines consist of unformed matters and non-formal functions. Every abstract machine is a consolidated aggregate of diagram. This is evident on a technological plane. Such a plane is not made up simply of formed substances, for aluminium, plastic, electric wire, etc., or organizing forms, programs, prototypes, etc., but of a composite of unformed matters exhibiting only degrees of intensity, resistance, conductivity, heating, stretching, speed or delay, induction, transduction, etc. And diagrammatic functions exhibiting only differential equations, or more generally, tensors. So again, just to what's significant in this passage is the claim that the positive characterization of matter can't rely on substance in a way of the opposition between the substantial opposition of form and content. In other words, form and content can't be understood as substantially articulated. The key aspects of a machinic organization or kind of coordination of matter is that it is unformed, which is not to say that it still has it's going to be its function can be characterized non-formally, because it consists of intensive differences. Intensities are qualities which can only be understood. It goes back to Deleuze's account of intensity in difference and repetition, where intensive difference is a difference of difference. It's characterized. It's the the positive difference. That's it's the qualitative difference that arises from the difference between two differences in quantity. And this account of intensity is another constant in Deleuze's thought. This intensive matter, abstract matter, is intensively characterized, and its functioning can't be understood in terms of the extensive properties of substances in which form and content are, bound together, ordinarily bound together. The second technical term introduced in this discussion is the tensor, okay? Tensors are the operators of torsion through which deformalization composes intensities or sign particles and flows on the plane of consistency. Again, the three elements, the intensities, the sign particles, and the flows. So it's these three kinds of, these positive features of abstract matter that are brought together through the tensor. So what they call diagrammatic composition is the identification of these points of torsion. But this composition requires concrete rules. There are rules of planing, of diagramming, as we will see later on. And combinations and conjunctions do not occur just in any fashion. So it's the rules. So they talk about these, rules of, in French, planification. These rules of, planing would be, I guess, the closest English equivalent, that ensure consistency. Not simply processes of decoding, deterritorialization or destratification as such. Again, why is this important? Is that, in other words, that once you kind of, if you understand the rejection of representation, you understand that deterritorialization doesn't just happen by itself. It's not something that is just kind of ongoing. It is the rules, it is the construction of the plane of consistency that, in a way, is the condition for the positive accounts of, decoding, deterritorialization, destratification, etc. And so in other words, it's through these rules, the concrete rules which effectuate, required to kind of, to construct the plane of consistency, that matter is deformalized. Okay, so these rules extract deformalized functions from the strata. A quote again: the plane of consistency is occupied, drawn by the abstract machine. The abstract machine exists simultaneously developed on the destratified plane it draws and enveloped in each stratum whose unity of composition it defines. And this play of development and envelopment is, again, crucial to the logic of expression, the expression of, abstract matter, which is at the heart of the book. So it's concrete rules that effectuate the abstract. And these concrete rules develop the abstract machines that are enveloped in the strata. And this development hinges upon the distinction between stratification and assemblage, agencement in French. Because stratification is the precondition for every machinic assemblage, and assemblages are at once territorial and deterritorializing, assemblage is the practical condition for the development of the abstract. And the key thing is that agencer is, in French, is a verb. Agencement is, an assembling, a self-assembling. And again, the sense in which, the self that is characteristic of this process of assembling is, again, can't simply be understood, can't simply be juxtaposed or contrasted to, the human subject or the subject of representation. This is why there has to be, if, these practical rules, or these concrete rules effectuate the abstract, the construction of the, plane of consistency, then there's a sense in which, again, you know, the personal and the impersonal, okay, or the so-called, you know, the the anthropomorphic and the, you know, the inhuman coincide in the composition of the plane of consistency, which is why it's not simply about, you know, accessing, you know, constructing a kind of a plane of consistency isn't simply about, you know, disassembling, you know, all the constraints of, you know, the constraints that, you know, characterize humanity, you know, subjectified, facialized, signifying, okay. So concrete assemblages develop abstract machines. So planification or planing is the concrete development of the enveloped abstract. It cuts across physical, biological, and anthropomorphic strata to compose unformed matters, anorganic life, and non-human becomings. These each corresponding to the three, you know, the physical, chemical strata, the biological strata, and, you know, the anthropomorphic strata. So the rules of destratification, I think, are the rules of planification, or the development of the enveloped. And here abstraction becomes a function of variation. Abstract, again, this is a quote, abstract does not mean universal, ideal, or eternal. It is a function of variation. There's no reason to tie the abstract to the universal or the constant, or to efface the singularity of abstract machines insofar as they are constructed around variables and variation. So concrete rules then are tensors of continuous variation. The constant is not opposed to the variable. It is a treatment of the variable opposed to the other kind of treatment, or continuous variation. So-called obligatory rules correspond to the first kind of treatment, whereas optional rules, that's Masumi's translation of règles facultatives, concern the construction of a continuum of variation. So that's what a plane of consistency is, a continuum of variation. Okay, so, and you know, an assembling then, I think, must be understood as a conjoining of saying and doing. And they distinguish between, you know, Deleuze and Guattari distinguish between two axes proper to the rules of assemblage. Okay, the first consisting of two different sets of questions. The first set of questions is which content, which expression, which, you know, they translate as meaning which regime of signs, which system of bodies. In each case, it is necessary to ascertain both what is said and what is done. You know, in each case, you know, in the construction, the concrete construction of the multiple, it's a case of ascertaining, you know, what is said and what is done. The second axis of the rules of assemblage is characterized in terms of these two questions. What are the cutting edges of deterritorialization, and what abstract machines do they effectuate? The concrete rules of assemblage thus operate along these two axes. On the one hand, what is the territoriality of the assemblage? What is the regime of signs in the pragmatic system? On the other hand, what are the cutting edges of deterritorialization, and what abstract machines do they effectuate? So I guess the upshot of all this, the upshot of these concrete rules for diagramming, you know, the plane of immanence and constructing, you know, a plane of consistency, is that diagramming lets us see to what extent a line of flight is destratificatory or liberatory for us. again, and this is why, I mean, this is in, you know, I mentioned this in the paper, that it's very interesting how Deleuze and Guattari, who are often kind of, you know, understood as proclaiming the kind of the constrictive status of you know, human organization, facialization, subjectification, etc., etc. Here, they quite clearly insist that, you know, if the, you know, the practical injunction is that of constructing a plane of consistency, then there are, you know, they explicitly propose concrete criteria for, you know, constructing a continuum of variation, which is to be, you know, can be evaluated and put into effect in, you know, in concrete, by human beings in specific you know, circumstances. Okay, this is why consistency proceeding by consolidation acts necessarily in the middle, by the middle, and stands opposed to all planes of principle or finality. And again, I take this to be another kind of reminder of why, you know, the construction, the destratification concomitant with the construction of a plane of consistency is not that of fusing with intensive matter, okay, or of merging with, you know, the so-called, you know, the full deterritorialized body of the earth. That would reinstate a principle of finality. Okay, that would be a transcendent and ultimately religious injunction, you know, to simply kind of dismantle oneself and to fuse with the cosmos. But interestingly, this is precisely what Deleuze and Guattari do not say and explicitly kind of reject in the, you know, in the, especially in this final plateau. And I think it's what they mean by the you know, there's a very interesting kind of positive, or, you know, kind of imagistic characterization of the multiple dimensions that are, you know, articulated in a continuum of variation in this following in this quote, okay, where they write, again, it's a long quote, but I'll read it. The plane of consistency is like a row of doors. Enfilade is the word used by Deleuze and Guattari, and an enfilade, interestingly enough, is a series of rooms which are joined by doors. So in other words, access, you know, the transition from one room to another is only through the connecting door. So an enfilade is precisely, you know, a series of rooms which can only be, you know, which are, you know, conjoined in space, but which cannot be accessed from the outside. And I take this, you know, again to mean that, you know, in other words, there is no exterior corridor connecting the rooms. You can only get from one room to another. You cannot access the rooms. You can't get from one room to another by going outside into a corridor. The corridor would be, you know, the extra plane, the plane of transcendence that connects, you know, the immanent dimension of each room. So the different dimensions of the plane of immanence are conjoined in this row-like fashion. I'll continue the quote. The concrete rules for the construction of the plane obtain to the extent that they exercise a selective role It is the plane, in other words, the mode of connection, that provides the means of eliminating the empty and cancerous bodies that rival the body without organs, of rejecting the homogeneous surfaces that overlay smooth space, and neutralizing the lines of death and destruction that divert the line of flight. What is retained and preserved, and therefore created, what consists, is only that which increases the number of connections at each level of division or composition, thus in descending as well as ascending order, and that which cannot be divided without changing in nature, or entering into a larger composition without requiring a new criterion of comparison. So this means that there's a whole process of selection of assemblages according to their ability to draw a plane of consistency with an increasing number of connections. And this, increasing the number, increasing connectivity is, the criterion of selection. Okay, it becomes a criterion of selection. This is why they continue schizoanalysis is not only a qualitative analysis of abstract machines in relation to assemblages, but also a quantitative analysis of the assemblages in relation to a presumably pure abstract machine. And so it's insofar as assemblages are conjoined in a way which increases the numbers of connection, okay, that they draw the plane of consistency more effectively or more consistently. Okay, almost done. I won't read this quote. It's on, I think, again, just this final quote reiterates the claim that the alloplastic strata, which they also call the anthropomorphic strata, are particularly propitious for the assemblages. In other words, that it's not just, I take this, philosophically to mean that, again, it's not just that, humanity, human organization, etc., is constrictive and disabling vis-a-vis the kind of the abstract matter, or the plane of consistency, but rather precisely that it allows greater reason, intensifying it of what is often denounced as a kind of a privileging of the human. In other words, those Guattari are saying that it's the peculiar privilege of the human is that it can it has a greater kind of capacity for assembling. Okay, the self-assembling of the plane of consistency is facilitated precisely by the modes of synthesis and structure, which are characteristic of the human. It's almost as if there's a kind of a greater degree of deformalization possible in and through the human than there is on the physical, chemical, or the biological strata. This leads into the issue about the problem of selection, which is the conclusion of the chapter, where I'm trying to kind of point out that in a way, the humans in a way, because humans, and again, it's human here is just a kind of a name or a tag. It's not a kind of an essential or metaphysical kind of characterization, but it's simply insofar as the kind of the effectuation of saying and doing carried out by human processes of assembling is also the point at which the plane of immanence effectuates itself or intensifies and multiplies its its dimensions. Then there's again, there's a kind of coincidence of the abstract and the concrete, which is, kind of peculiar to, which, can't circumvent the contingencies of, that are operative on the kind of the human, strata, on the in the human dimension. So, in other words, the plane selects itself, the plane constructs itself through the human's effectuation, through the human development of the enveloped abstraction. And the consequence is that if the selection of destratified traits, intensities, particle signs, flows operates according to criteria discernible only from within the anthropomorphic strata, has our composition of consistency not re-enveloped the abstract in the concrete? Have we not absolutely relativized the absolute? I mean, they talk about the absolute as a movement, not a, not a substance or a subject, but a movement. But the absolute movement can only be, concretely effectuated through these rules for constructing the plane of consistency. And then, the question is whether machinic pragmatism can be so kind of confidently contrasted to less, less glamorous or less kind of, a more banal kind of pragmatism. That's the, in other words, the sophistication with which the Deleuze and Guattari, a naive finalism, which would say that the point is to kind of simply, the human is a kind of, is a trap, and we have to get out of it, somehow, so the point is to kind of, to undo or to liquidate the human. They avoid that, I think, what they take to be a kind of a metaphysical trap, but then they bring the immanence of the abstract and the concrete, means that the process of the selection of intensification over disintensification, and of the injunction to increase the kind of the dimensions of intensive qualities, doesn't become a kind of I guess a kind of aestheticism, really. Okay, that's it. That's just a kind of a rough kind of paraphrase of the of the movement of the paper. So I'll stop there, and shall we have a break now before the discussion, or what do you think?
Yeah, if you would like, we can take a like 5-minute break. You would
Okay.
like that? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. See this. Should we continue, Ray?
Sure. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for the presentation and great talk. Um, I want to start with David, but I'm not sure if he's here right now. I think he's not back yet. So, can you stop your screen sharing? If
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Ray, and welcome back, everyone. I would like to begin and passing the mic to David Roden to start the discussion. As many of you know, David is the philosopher who led our first study group, and we are really thankful to him for getting this series started. Hi, David.
Hi, sepideh, and hi, Ray. Thanks for a wonderful piece of exegesis. Right, I mean, as often is the case, Ray, I think I find the questions I end up asking of you are questions you're already asking of yourself. So it may seem that I'm simply reiterating, particularly your concluding discussion here. I mean, I guess my worry, I guess, here is about the relation between, if you like, the ontological level, sort of laid out here in terms of the stratic synthesis, the way that relates to the virtual dimension, the sort of non-individuated multiplicities, or the plane inconsistency. So there's a kind of obviously there's a very brilliant and clear sort of ontological thesis about the emergence of the actual, about the emergence of concrete entities, assemblages. And my concern, I guess, is the way the notion of practice can map onto this. And in a sense, you've already telegraphed this by contrasting Deleuze and Guattari's kind of pragmatism to the sort of liberal pragmatism of, I guess, figures like Rorty or Brandon, if we're bandying names. And yet it's not clear what's left of the notion of practice if we have a notion of agency which, as I think you mentioned, and as Deleuze and Guattari also say, cuts across all these different ontological domains. In the sense, it applies as much to the level of the sort of physiochemical interactions, to the formation of kind of biological structures, as to the socio-political sphere. So in a sense, if there is a notion of agency here, it seems to be a genuinely post-humanist one, which in a sense can't be identified with the activity of a particular subject. So I guess my worry is, well, how does a kind of practical philosophy or an ethics fall out. This ontological articulation? And I guess, yeah, I mean, I'll leave it at that, Ray, because I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that. I mean, I think yes. I think that, I mean, related to that is the question of the construction here, and I guess the idea of the construction of the plane of consistency, because in a sense, one can understand the plane of consistency as a kind of virtual field, or as I guess something like a vector field, which is not sort of representable. It's not simply a kind of set of kind of numerical quantities or vectors in a purely mathematical sense, but it has some kind of pre-existent structure as a sort of form of organization. And so the role of the concrete rules or the abstract machine seems to be, again, completely general. It seems to sort of not be in any sense privileging sort of human agency, even if, as Deleuze and Guattari said, and as you say, human agencies particularly act to set up various forms of deterritorialization or decoding. So yeah, I guess my worry is both what is the place of the human, and particularly of practice in this, given the initially post-humanist cast of the ontology, and also whence the injunction to deterritorialize? Why have an injunction to deterritorialize at all, when in a sense what one is describing are propensities and tendencies of systems, and sure, perhaps certain systems present certain opportunities by virtue of there being certain critical points within the abstract machine that's enveloped within the system. Why does it follow that we should, why should there be an injunction to, in a sense, tip those critical points or approach them? Why, in a sense, should there be a kind of normative element to this at all? I mean, it always, that again, always seems to sit uneasily with me with the ontological dimension that you've laid out.
Okay, thanks. Just I guess that's a key question. That's the point is that the point at which there's no longer it's almost as if there's a point of indiscernibility between the human and the non-human in the the concrete effectuation of the abstract machine, the construction of the plane of consistency. This is what, when they say the point is no longer to say I, but where it no longer matters whether or not one says I. And this is where, if you think about it, so this is the self-assembling of the real. They say, the construction of the real. To give up representation is to say that there is no, reality is not out there, kind of fixed and determinate, and kind of the philosophical task is not to give a more adequate representation of the real, and therefore the the normative is what is to be done in thinking and doing is not answerable to some objectively specifiable or representable structures or norms. And in a way that one of the things they're saying is that the opposition between freedom and determinism, or between kind of libertarianism and determinism, is an artifice of representation, of the representational kind of setup. So if you reject that representational paradigm, then it's not, what's left is not simply an impersonal domain of objective determination, just going on. Determination is also kind of called into question, because determination is an effect and not a precondition of stratic synthesis. So causal kind of, structures of causal determination are, only unfold, within stratified kind of structures. So the genesis of stratification is itself not determinable. It can't be. There's no kind of, there's no way of specifying the way in which strata, strata are the condition for emergence and determination. Therefore, no account of the emergence or determination of strata can be given. And that's the radicality. That's the ontological radicality of this kind of materialism. Is what the abstract matter is precisely not kind of. It's not just that it doesn't consist of interacting substances. It doesn't have any kind of substantial form whatsoever. So it's not the processes unfolding on this kind of at the level of the full body of the earth, the deterritorialized, etc. can't be mapped through any kind of set of, positive, conceptual description, and that's also, I guess, I think why, although it's always illuminating to unpack Deleuze and Guattari's kind of, jargon, using dynamical systems theory and kind of complexity theory. I mean, that's always illuminating, but precisely if that's, I think what they're saying is, their philosophy would describe, the full body resources of.
I thought you dropped, you disappeared on us, right? Shall I respond briefly? I don't know if I got all of that. There was I think there was a bandwidth issue. I guess. I think I can accept that causal, for Deleuze and Guattari, it rather reminds me of Nancy Cartwright's philosophy of science here, that causal regularities are, in a sense, constructed by if you like, by assemblages, by, for example, screening out certain influences, amplifying other influences. So yeah, they're not sort of traditional realists in the sense that they're presenting us with a universe of fixed objects with fixed potentialities and fixed dispositions. At the same time, the processes, or the processes of actualization whereby these mechanisms come into being are essentially impersonal. They're not, or at least they can have, obviously, a human role, have a human participation, sociocultural. They need not be. So there are some. Deleuze and Guattari do seem to be some kind of realists. They seem to be talking about processes which, at least in principle, can be mind independent. So I guess while I can see that there can be a role for the human in all this, and I'm kind of in agreement with you that you shouldn't simply flatten or level the human non-human distinction here. At the categorical level, it seems to me problematic still to talk about a privileged role for practice, if by practice we mean something like the sort of things that people do, or whether collectively or individually, since the process of stratic synthesis itself, the process of actualization, are themselves not mind dependent, not human dependent. And I was trying to be careful about sort of mapping dynamic systems analysis onto the virtual. I realized that there's some subtleties there, and I agree that you need to be cautious. But it still seems to me that the virtual is something essentially impersonal, or independent of the personal or the human. So I guess I'm still worried about how we fit practice, how we map practice onto this ontological level, and also where the injunction comes from. I mean, after all, there's an idea I use in my work on posthumanism called functional autonomy, and it's very much, in a sense, like the capacity to affect and be affected. It's in a sense, you increase functional autonomy by increasing your ability to kind of connect with other systems and increasing the range of systems over, if you like, the latitude of your interactions with the world. And that's certainly something that can happen. It's something you can do by, for example, learning to ride a bike, you know, something as simple as that. But there seems to be, at best, the imperative to increase functional autonomy is hypothetical rather than categorical. There seems to be no inherent worth in it. So I'm still kind of worried about this, you know, the suggestion that somehow there is an injunction to deterritorialize if you could understand increasing functional autonomy as like deterritorialization. It seems to fall out of nowhere. But I'll shut up because I realize I've probably gone on a bit too long.
No, thanks. That's I mean, I think, yeah, that's I mean, should I respond or sepideh, or do you want to, you know, are there other questions? Or, I mean, I could quickly respond to David.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I think the claim is that you know, these optional rules. So it's not, you know, the claim is not that ultimately this is a kind of this collateral placentalism. It's more interesting than that, because it calls into question between the inhuman and the non-human, or between, you know, you know, I think part of what they're saying is that you know, you still need, they're providing you with the conceptual resources through in terms of which you no longer have to think in those terms, and you know, proposing for the construction of the plane of consistency, they say are, you know, they're optional. That means that there's no kind of transcendent injunction, you know, to realize or to produce anything. That would be you know, falling back into the kind of traditional kind of models of agency, which they're, you know, kind of explicitly disavowing, in this suggestion that the impersonal and the personal become indiscernible. So the point is that the human, in a way, is you know, the grip or the constraint of the human is optimally loosened when you you know, think about, you know, intensifying, you know, so think about kind of amplifying and intensifying the, as you put it, the kind of the modalities of, you know, affecting and being affected. That is straightforwardly kind of Spinozist, the kind of, but look, the refrain in the book that constructivism and expressionism must coincide. This is one of the methodological kind of refrains in the book. The points, if you ditch representation, you can understand construction and expression as coinciding. And that means that, you know, the, you know, abstract matter expresses itself through its construction, and the agent of, you know, the constructing agent is also, you know, the point is that the agent of construction is itself constructed through this process. That's what it means to get rid of representation. It's not, there's no longer kind of an object substance, personal domain expressing itself, on the subjective pole, nor is there a kind of, an individual subject, expressing itself in the objective domain. It's that the agency is distilled and effectuated through this, through these processes, which can't be, which depend on contingent selections, and can't be, to say that they're unrepresentable is to say that they can't be mapped. They can't be objectively mapped. So I think this is, what's really striking about this book is that how it kind of, it's very, very unlike, something like new materialism, although it's, doesn't Guattari kind of, align with new materialism. But it's, this rejection of representation means that you can't just talk about matter as if it was out there, waiting to be kind of, so it's not about kind of, circumventing subjectivity to kind of, to realize that as if subjectivity was preventing you from seeing all these, these intensive processes going on. It's that, and this is actually why I think even the distinction between virtual and actual is no longer operative in this book. And there's a, there's a footnote in one point in the Plateau Memoirs of a Sorcerer. They contrast the plane of consistency, the plane of immanence, and the plane of transcendence, and it's almost as if the plane of the virtual actual disjunction and the whole problem of actualization is again to kind of presupposes this, what they think is it's still too beholden to the, the premises of representation. The idea that there is this surplus or excess that has to be, that is only kind of residually actualized. So that's another kind of, important difference between, that's why construction is at the heart of the book and not actualization. But no, I understand your concern. I mean, yeah, it's a very, I think it's that undermines the kind of the premises upon which you could, and anyway, that's we should take more questions, I think.
Yeah, Marcus has a question, but please after this just unmute yourself and go ahead, ask your questions. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, my question is also related now to this topic about subjectivity. There is this early essay by Félix Guattari about machine structure. This is just the title, from 1969. And this is very interesting because there he refers very affirmative to a concept of representation in saying we could also say that the revolutionary stage includes a time in which the machine is able to represent the structure of social subjectivity. And the other way around, that in the stage of repression, the stage of stagnation would be the stage in which the superstructure is not able to represent the effects of the machine. And this is a very interesting quote for what we discuss right now, because this would mean the revolutionary stage, in what Guattari describes here as a revolutionary stage, has to be able to represent what he calls social subjectivity, so the revolutionary subject. But this would mean that there has to be a difference between subjectivity and the machine, but the machine has to be able, at least in the revolutionary stage. So right now, obviously, we are not in the evolutionary stage. So the machine is not able to represent the effects of the machine. So when we think on the machinery fragment by Marx, he has the same thought when he says the machine becomes more and more like the artist or the craftsman, and the worker become more and more like the machinery itself in the production. This is why the machine can do it by its own, as Marx says. So this would mean this is exactly a stage of what he calls repression here. There has to be a different stage, a revolutionary stage, where the machine, or the difference between machine and subjectivity, could be presented or represented in the machine itself. And this is an interesting thought. So would you, so how would you think the let's say, role or function of subjectivity in this kind of representation? Do you think then that the machine is able or could be able to represent subjectivity? And of course, what subjectivity is defined here is not very clear. It's the revolutionary subjectivity. So it means a transformation, of course, of subjectivity. But at least Guattari in this essay thinks the machine has to be able to represent subjectivity, at least in the revolutionary stage.
Okay, thanks. That's really, really interesting, actually. In a way, I mean, I don't know if I can really, I need to kind of, think a lot, it would take me a long time to kind of figure out a plausible kind of response. But quickly, I mean, in a way, the machine representing subjectivity is part of, what they call, when they talk about the machinic agencement, and in French, like agencement is like a verb, it's like a doing. Agencer is like, a doing. In a way, it's like, the agencement is the kind of, the machine representing the subject, but representing its own kind of, its own subjectivation. Although, so the category of, subject is obviously rejected by Deleuze and Guattari because they, it's Kantian, Hegelian, I guess even phenomenological, and they want no truck with that. But what's really interesting, I mean, is that they, it's clear it's not a naive objectivism, and it's not, and Deleuze, and they're two kind of, philosophically, they want to kind of to displace the primacy or the priority of the subject without falling back into a naive objectivism, a naive representationalism. So in other words, they want to kind of, in a way, that what the book is doing is describing the resources through which, as they put, the kind of the real assembles itself and represents itself. And so this is why the kind of the whole kind of the articulation of saying and doing, both at the opening of the book, and at the close of the book is really, really struck me. It's so the point is that this, assembling, machinic assembling is not kind of, it doesn't kind of unfold through, it can't be channeled through subjectivity as traditionally understood, doesn't involve apperception, doesn't involve self-consciousness, ontological pre-understanding. But there is, in a way, there is a kind of a latent, although they don't use the word, I mean, it still seems that there is a kind of, again, the point of coincidence between construction and expression is the self-assembling of, you know, the plane of immanence. Okay, so it assembles itself, and the self at issue is precisely, you know, can't be it's not the kind of the individual kind of, you know, it's not the individual, or is it the rational cognizing self? It's some other kind of, it's another self, you know, a machinic, you know, a machinic subject, if you want. But that's, but again, one in which the process, you know, the workings of the machine are not, you know, the difference between a machine and a mechanism in this whole account is that machines are self-assembling, and they, you know, their functioning, you know, undermines the kinds of, you know, the finalities, the recognizable finalities in terms of which the operation is usually described. So that's why, yeah, I mean, so I don't know if I can really, yeah, but that's a really interesting kind of, you know, I must reread that essay, but there's a close relation, in a way, structure, in a way, structure is always a consequence of stratification. And what they want to say is that, you know, machinic assembling is a kind of, is a model of, it's supposed to kind of, it's a way of accounting, not for the genesis of structure, but it provides the resources for, it does the work that is, you know, traditionally relegated to structure in a representational philosophy. So in other words, if you say that the world consists of these structures, okay, these structures have these characteristics, and then, you know, you oppose kind of, you know, structure and subject. Well, they're kind of bypassing that opposition by saying there's, if we can articulate, you know, we find this point in the middle where, you know, there's stratification and destratification, and this is where machinic assembling unfolds, you know, at the kind of the junction of stratification and destratification. And machinic assembling then allows you to make the selections and discriminations for which structure was traditionally invoked. And this is kind of the power, I mean, the philosophy, the ingenuity of the book, but yes, it's where you end up once you've made these moves. That's what is puzzling, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. That helps.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Going off Marx's last question, in Balance Sheet for Desiring, well, I guess what I really want to ask is, in assembling the machine, right, where do you see desire playing into any of this? As in subjectivity.
Yes, yeah. Well, desiring production, I mean, in a way, the, you know, assembling, agencement, is, it seems to kind of to do the work of, you know, desiring production, that, you know, desiring production did in Anti-Oedipus. So clearly kind of desire is I don't know why. I mean, I'm not sure why. I don't think the word desire, but I think that's. But look, I think that in a way, the kind of the desire for intensification, for amplification. You know, the amplifying. You know, one's capacity to affect and be. You know, or not one. Okay. The capacity to affect and be affected is, you know, the how desire would be kind of cashed out. So desire is productive in the sense that, you know, kind of desire is, you know, the principle of, you know, machinic assembling, which involves intensifying and increasing you know, dimensions of you know, sensation, you know, kind of take. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, when they're talking about this process of intensification and of amplifying one's, you know, the modalities of not only one's power of acting, but one's power of being acted upon. This is desire. This is a kind of another kind of a word for what they call desire in Anti-Oedipus. Yeah, it involves. But I think here, why they reject the Lacanian model of desire, because I think it's too simple to say. And here, this is also like, I'm unconvinced by the claim that desire, you know, psychoanalytic desire is all about lack and castration, and I
entirely agree. I entirely agree.
I'm unconvinced by that, and in a way, I mean, yeah, you could. This is what, you know, if you kind of there's something good. Yeah, if you give this entirely positive, or this what you think is an entirely positive kind of characterization of desire as productive, you know, amplificatory, intensifying, etc. Weirdly, it becomes aestheticized, I think.
Ray, excuse me, can you turn off your camera? Maybe helps with the quality of your voice.
Sure, sure.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
Let me start with a comment. I really love the work of Deleuze, as well as Deleuze and Guattari, but sometimes it's really easy to get lost in the sauce of the terminological swirls.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would like to do is to back up in the history of Deleuze's work in order to address the relationship between what you've been discussing and the concerns for ethics that both you and David were addressing to each other. So we know that Deleuze was really influenced by Solomon Maimon's critique of the Kantian manifold. And if you remember, the manifold is an extension that has lots of different forms. In Euclid, in calculus, and in phase space. When Maimon dismantles Kant's manifold in order to insist that time and space in a relational grid is not a priori in the intuition, but that difference is the fundamental a priori, and that time is the way in which differences unfold.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's pretty clear, even in Solomon Maimon, and definitely true in Deleuze, is that when one takes into account difference in the context of time and then space, that there are lots of different kinds of mathematics and specifically geometries that can be placed in the manifold.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, in Leibniz, infinitesimals and differentials come out of his philosophy and then enter into his mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And in Solomon Maimon, you can see the shift from Euclidean models of the manifold to the calculus of Newton and Leibniz. Now, the language of Deleuze in Difference and Repetition On seems to embrace phase space. And so the references to plane of consistency and the variable condition of striated or smooth space associated with that suggests an instability whereby one moves back towards a model based on the striations of infinitesimal calculus, or more towards the smooth space of phase space. Now, if you look at the language that Deleuze brings to bear when he's talking about hierarchy, modality, striations, it's pretty clear that he's using the language of calculus, whereas when he's talking about individuation, when he's talking about aggregation, he's referring to the ways in which emergent systems get modeled in phase space. Now, it seems to me that what you've been describing is the way he delineates between the mind's tendency towards the kind of differentiation that we associate with calculus versus the kind of aggregation that we associate with phase space. And there, I'm simplifying things just in order to be able to shut up sooner than I would like to. But it seems to me that they're building a system by which their readers will be able to construct an ethics of cognition, which is a term I coined a long time ago, with reference to smooth and striated space. And so one could consider this as a manual of use for constructing a manifold that is smooth instead of striated. So the question is, since this language of phase space and calculus applies to the world of physiochemical actions, but that Deleuze and Guattari, like Simondon, seem to want to have that drift into not just percepts, but concepts. In other words, not just our attempts to grapple with the real, but also with the ideal. And so I'm wondering, the references that clearly point to trans-individuality, pre-individuality, which is both applying to social cognition, which is someone had just raised, as well as individual cognition. What are your fundamental objections to the reference to something that, on the one hand, people have dismissed as a kind of panpsychism, but which I suggest is material in the sense of a new materialism that Deleuze and Guattari themselves have identified with, for example, individuation, which is the same thing as bifurcation in physical systems and phase space. So the question is, given how invested that Deleuze and Guattari are into the fact that this notion of a manifold as plane, as smooth space, applies to both our cognition of the world as well as the operations of our cognitive properties themselves. How do you object to that concept, and on what grounds?
Okay, let me.
And I mean, I don't know your work real well, but I do know that this seems to be one of your fundamental objections to Deleuze and Guattari, as well as
yes.
to Simondon.
Actually, yes. I guess that's that's fair. Yes. Why do I? What's my problem with, kind of aligning the the smooth space as a kind of as an ontological category, and I think you said smoothing as a smoothing.
But it's also an epistemological category, and I'm making the suggestion it's also an ethical category.
Yeah, I just don't think it's possible to align ethics, epistemology, and ontology in this way. And I guess I'm suspicious of philosophies that do this, okay, that align them in this way. And that's why, I mean, look, here's one way of, you mentioned, the contrast between, kind of the kind of space on the one hand and kind of, differential kind of striation. The question, on what, okay, that's a kind of, that distinction is intra-mathematical. So the conditions under which you generalize it and say that it's a kind of, it's a fundamental, it can be used to kind of, to distinguish two species of phenomena, as well as two ways of describing those phenomena. I mean, yeah, you can do this, but I mean, I think that's in a way,
But Maimon identifies this as noumena. This is how noumena create relations among objects and concepts. And this is something that clearly Deleuze borrows.
Yes.
And what I'm suggesting is that Thousand Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus are, except in a sense, horrible metaphor, but exfoliates
no, No, that's very, I mean, I think you're probably right. But then the question is, well, couldn't you do this, the points, you know, this point of articulation for, you know, kind of for, you know, the object and the concept. I mean, if this point, you know, couldn't any other, you could do it in, you know, you could do any other kind of set of oppositions could also be proposed as a candidate, you know, as the joint or the hinge between, you know, the conceptual and, you know, the objective, or, you know, or between the phenomenal and the noumenal. And
let me just interrupt for 1 second. That this has been the complaint, for example, in the world of philosophy of science, particularly with reference to metaphor theory. The question, is this metaphorical or is this real?
Yeah.
And so we run up against the complaint that metaphor cannot cut the world at its joints, which was the metaphor that I think you were just using. But on the other hand, this is exactly the kind of thing that Poincaré says in his famous essay on creativity and method, science and method. I cannot explain it in any other way. And so that, but let's get back to this underlying field, which is time, and which is contingent, unidirectional, and upon which we superimpose differences in order to establish relations and make sense of both the world and of concepts.
Yes, but the problem is, you know, how the characterization of time is itself, like, you know, what datum provides the starting point for the characterization of time.
Well, Deleuze clearly establishes that difference as the eternal return of difference sense of the world, which is how he turns Kant on his head, and how he transforms the differential into pure contingency. The differential of Solomon Maimon into pure contingency.
No, I take your point. I guess look, it's Bergson. You know, Deleuze, you know, draws on Bergson, and Bergson, you know, Bergson claims, you know, the immediate data, you know, of consciousness is the kind of the experience of duration, you know, the qualitative differentiation of time, and I think, you know, Deleuze's whole account of intensity is closely connected to this account, this ontologization of duration. But then the problem is that the claims that, you know, these intensive differences, you know, are simply are accessible in this kind of, you know, sub-representational element. You know, you experience the qualitative differentiation of duration, you know, as time in itself, independently of representing, categorizing, conceptualizing. I just don't believe that. I think that the contrast between intensive and extensive is conceptual, and I think that Bergson substitutes a conceptual construction, you know, a kind of a registering of qualitative difference, you know, in the place of where this allegedly kind of, you know, immediate, you know, intuitive, preconceptual experience of the thing itself, of time itself unfolding in consciousness is supposed to happen. And, you know, this is where like the Kantian questions about, Kant's point is that even our own experience is mediated by representation. We can't, what we know about the features of our, our own kind of, the features of our own experience, requires the machinery of judgment. And everyone, I know that, obviously Deleuzians will reject this. And in a way, this book in particular is I think, Deleuze's most sophisticated attempt to work out the consequences of that rejecting by explaining, by coming up with an account of, how there's a judgment in the real that conditions, ideal judgment or subjective epistemological judgment. But the problem is that the characterization of this judgment in the real, i.e. stratic synthesis, is a conceptual construction, which, your point about the jargon was actually, it's a very important point. Whenever one is trying to explain, one is trying to explain Deleuze's account of stratification, as I was, one faces a chance. So I end up kind of just paraphrasing using this terminology. The problem is this, is that if philosophy is conceptual creation, then there's a problem if you simply try to translate the concepts into, to make them crisper and more precise using, let's say, like an empirical science, dynamical systems theory, complexity theory, kind of, et cetera, then it's no longer a conceptual creation. Okay, if Deleuze's accounts of all these kinds of, processes in the real can simply be converted, translated without loss, using the vocabulary of autonomous kind of physical and mathematical sciences.
Yeah, that's the problem of metaphor. I agree
yes,
with that. But then we're up against what Poincaré said is I don't know how to do it any other way.
But
so is there a more rigorous way? This is a problem for transdisciplinarity in any way. We know that because it's so difficult to do what Maimon talks about in terms of building coalitions among different philosophers, or what many of us have been trying to do by juxtaposing different disciplines, like Deleuze and Guattari exhort us to do when he says, in order to know really anything, we have to balance scientific percepts with scientific concepts with artistic constructs. The way I've been at it recently is by filtering these concepts through problems like what's the relationship between individual and collective cognition in a jazz ensemble while performing. For example, that's one of the ways which I try to bring these questions to the fore. And I get, it's, I think transdisciplinarity is really powerful. But how do we do it rigorously? What I'm saying, and I think you're resisting, is that Deleuze is pretty much bought into transdisciplinary inquiry by constructing coalitions, by constructing aggregations of conceptual frameworks from different disciplinary striations and hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, what objection ontologically as well as epistemologically do you have to the mathematical as well as conceptual application of smooth space in both the physical world and in the world of ideation?
Because the concept of smooth space seems to me to be arbitrary. And any, you can cash it out in terms of phase spaces, but then you get this problem of like, well, then if when they're talking about smooth space, they just mean kind of phase spaces, then it becomes, metaphorical. And the problem is the conviction that ontology is necessary, which increasingly my view is that ontology, and again, as I said, already said, I think that the rehabilitation of ontology in the 20th century is problematic. And if you're no longer doing ontology as interpreting the meaning of being, and if you're no longer doing ontology, it's not simply enough to say, all we need to do, to renovate ontology is not to identify being with substance, okay? We'll identify being with process, with becoming. But, the pre-Socratics did that, okay? So like simply kind of talking about process and becoming instead of, substance and form is not a kind of a convincing kind of, justification.
Let me just, if I could just say, I'm deeply empathetic toward your position and the ways in which your system is built on that. Deeply admire that. I just wonder, for example, where we get the idea that substance and process are different. In other words, is it either being or becoming? If you have a smooth space in Deleuze and Guattari's presentation, and that space can either be striated or smooth, and that how that happens, there's a certain element of contingency involved. That suggests that there are two aspects of the same thing, that striations and aggregation and becoming are two aspects of the same continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, for example, that's, what a lot of people, including someone who figures into this discussion a lot with reference to Bergson and Prigogine is, Bergson and Deleuze is Prigogine,
mm-hmm.
who is a very philosophical fellow, by the way.
I know.
I'm confronting this particular issue, not to confront you, but because I think it's really important in how we evaluate Deleuze and Guattari.
Okay. No, I appreciate. I think, I understand what you're saying. I think it would. I take your point. Yeah, I think it would take us a lot longer to kind of work through. I think there's a fundamental disagreement about the starting point for
right. Yeah, and that is, I think it's possible to talk about that.
Okay. Martin, excuse me, can we move on?
And I'll stop there. Sorry.
It's okay. Just trying to get everybody's question. So, who else has a question? I think David. Yeah, go ahead. Excuse me, Martin. Sorry. Yeah.
Should I read the should I read the question or? Okay. Yes. Okay. So I'll read David's question in relation to my paper D11, does a stratified ontology constitute a flat ontology? And if it's not the case, what kind of relation exists between them? Because as far as I understand it, a stratified ontology would refuse or at least modify thesis 3 about the subject-object relation, and 4 about the ontological non-hierarchy, or flattening all entities on the same plane of existence, which you consider to entail a flat ontology, thus constituting neither a flat nor a hierarchical ontology. Okay. Yes, the word, the way in which the word stratification is used in the paper you're referring to, that's Roy Bhaskar's sense when he talks about stratified ontologies. It's like a layer cake ontology, and which is precisely the way it seems to me that this is the account of stratification can't be understood either in terms of, this, a hierarchy of levels, nor simply a kind of, a de-leveling, a flattening. And that's what makes it very, very interesting. So the point is that these, there's no, in a way, what Deleuze and Guattari give you is this kind of, in a way, it's like, trying to kind of, the strata and the 3 fundamental types of strata, I guess, would correspond to the, the 3 fundamental joints of being. If metaphysics is about carving nature of the joints, but on their account they can't be, or at least it doesn't, it wouldn't make sense simply to kind of to understand the strata as sedimentations or cumulative layers. Because then, if that's the case, then that means that the kind of the strata, each of these 3 types of strata, are connected to one another according to principles. Something like a metastratic synthesis would be necessary to articulate the 3, layers of stratification. And I might be wrong, but I'm not sure that that's that is the case, or that they give such account. However, it's clear that what they call, the plane of consistency involves a kind of what they call kind of deterritorialization, involves cutting through the 3 kind of types of strata. So in a way, it's a cut through these 3 levels, but then yes, you don't have this is what kind of produces something new, and at least it's not, yes, it can't simply be understood in terms of the opposition between kind of flattening or leveling and de-leveling, as discussed in this in the paper. So in other words, I don't think that Deleuze and Guattari have a flat ontology, in the sense, in this sense. And the reason is because it's not sure, like it's the earth. Look, if stratification and destratification are kind of, indissociable in a sense. You start in the middle, you start in between, you know, what's stratified and destratified, or between, you know, the abstract machine and its kind of, you know, the concrete assemblage. Then it's the deterritorialized, the full body of the earth, in, you know, is not, you know, is, you know, the residue of destratification. It's not as if it's there first, okay? The mistake, the representational error would be to think that you've got the full body of the earth, the deterritorialized, and then stratification, then you get stratification, sedimentation, layering, okay? And then deterritorialization involves kind of, you know, getting back towards this, the originary earth, the deterritorialized. But in fact, what they're suggesting is that, you know, it's, you know, the deterritorialized is nothing but absolute movement is generated through the, you know, what they call, you know, the torque of absolute movement. The absolute is a quality of movement and not a substance or an entity, nor is it even pure becoming in this kind of, you know, nebulous metaphysical sense. So that's why I think, you know, you can't characterize their work in terms of, you know, a flat ontology, where it assumes that the kind of, you know, the univocal, you know, the plane of being, of ontological equivalence is somehow given, whereas their whole point is that it has to be, you know, constructed. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
There's a question from Blissero. Do you want to go ahead and ask a question? Yeah.
Hi, sir. Good evening. Do you guys hear me, by the way?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was a very, very interesting reading of the chapter. Very much enjoyable. Thank you for that. What strikes me the most on the part of your reading from the chapter is that as if there's a parallel between the project of Dolzangotara here and the kind of empiricist project that has been present in philosophy since Hume, maybe, or even before that. In a sense that if in difference and repetition, if I remember correctly, there's this concept of particular difference, and Deleuze persists that in contradiction or if abstract difference, if I remember the name correctly or the jargon correctly, we come to contradiction, which is the most different thing that can be, and it's just construct of the kind of conceptualization that the Enlightenment reason does, or the Enlightenment science does, to make the sense of the world or has a traction on the world. So he wants to remain with the skepticism of Hume, but in a very strange way, in a very, I don't know, maybe towards way, in a way that we have difference and repetition. There is some kind of abstraction in nature and in the whole itself, in the God or nature itself. There is a kind of abstract machine. That subjectivity and all kind of abstraction that a subjectivity or a human does, or a human reason does, is actually arrived from this abstract machine that can produce the plane of consistency. And what human subject must do is aspire to do the same, to realize the plane of consistency outside of the quote unquote Enlightenment or Kantian reason. And what we should do is extending the project of empiricism in a way that we can arrive at that. And that's one point. I don't know if I articulate myself clearly. And what else? One more point that I wanted to make was that the non-formal content on the unformed matter, which it is as if their project of pragmatism is this in this contention that what human does, what through the virality, or I don't know, living matter of language or sign particles, is to entail some kind of unformal content on an unformed matter. And what we do in semantics is not necessarily what analytic philosophy wants us to do, but is a very more dirty work. So what we do is almost non-tractable, as if it's a Wittgensteinian point. If I understand all these that I heard about from you from this reading. So if that is true, then my final question is their understanding of the plane of consistency. What difference is there is between the plane of consistency and, say, something like the process of synthetic unity of a perception, of a Kantian understanding? There is difference between them is the material consistent, is the scientific material incompatibility of Kantian system, and on the other hand, some more, I don't know, nomadic metallurgical materiality of Deleuze and Guattari? Thank you.
Sorry, just that was a. Could you just repeat the last the closing formulation, the question? So, because I'm not sure I got everything, but if you could just repeat that your closing question, that would be helpful.
Sure. Sorry if I rumbled on and it wasn't clear.
No, it's there's a lot in what you said. So
yes, I'm sorry. The last part was that the plane of consistency. What is the difference between some process of producing a plane of consistency and a process like synthetic unity of a perception that consists? It is supposed to be anti-Kantian plane of consistency because of what the rumbling that I was about. That I think it wasn't clear. But at the end, it's not clear to my head that what is the difference. The only difference that I can see is the claim that he makes in the difference and repetition, that the conceptual difference is, which has contradiction and has dialects, is just a human relic. A human, something you read from them, actually, if I understand you correctly, something you read from them in this, I don't know, now do you understand me? Or am I unclear? If I'm unclear, I let it go, sorry.
I think, okay, let me try to respond. And if what I say, doesn't, if what I say doesn't connect with what you were trying to say, then you can correct me and push me towards, your concern. But I think you're asking about, when you mentioned kind of Deleuze's kind of critique of, the primacy of contradiction in the difference of repetition, the claim that, he wants to, he wants a philosophy of difference. He wants a concept of difference that would not be reducible to a difference in the concept. So, and his rejection of kind of both of Kantianism and Hegelianism is that it substitutes, movement in the concept, exchanges of conceptual determination for real movements, and yes, and then that's a very deep problem. The problem is this: is that how does one, if one is a philosopher, as Deleuze is, one is committed to the concept and to using the resources of the concept, to grasp the non-conceptual, a reality that is not conceptual. And the problem then is, on the one hand, the critique of the relegation of difference to conceptual difference, or the claim that every difference is ultimately conceptual, is that there are differences in the real that can't be, that don't map on to either kind of opposition or contradiction. But then it's also that, but it's not simply that concepts are psychological categories, because the depsychologization of the concept happens with Kant and Hegel, so the claim then is a dispute about which concepts are most adequate to grasping real movement or real difference. But then Hegel's problem is about how do you tell the difference between the difference in the concept and the real difference that is elided by or irreducible to the difference in the concept. And then you're back to this standpoint between concepts and intuitions. It seems to me what you can't do is resort to intuition and say, we intuit real differences. And once we've intuited real differences in being, the task is to construct concepts that are uniquely tailored to grasping, individual, the difference of individuation, for instance, or pre-individual singularities. So it seems to me that Deleuze's account of conceptual construction is Bergsonian, because it's Bergson who says that representation, the categories of representation, are too loose and baggy, to track, the, real differences, which are kind of singularities that can't be, pincered between, universal and particularity. But then the construction of concepts that kind of, that express singularities, pre-individual singularities, is carried out on the basis of this, preconceptual intuition of, being a singular or being singular expressions. And that's where the problem comes in, is like, how do you know, a Hegelian will just say, well, look, you can't, you need to explain, how you're able to intuit, how you have this non-conceptual intuition of real difference, on the basis of which you can disqualify, let's say, contradiction as a merely conceptual difference, and then propose this idea of concepts as, the similarities. And yeah, the problem is that every, I don't see how you can kind of, given that I don't think there is any access to, it's one thing to say that there is no cognitive access to the real without concepts, is not to say that reality is intrinsically conceptual. It's just to say, as Hegel already said, that the difference between the real and the idea, or the conceptual and the non-conceptual, can only be tracked using the resources of the concept. But it's not to ontologize concepts. And if you reject that, it seems that you can't reject it because it's clear that what a concept is for Hegel, it's not a psychological state. You can't psychologize it. So whatever your reasons for rejecting this, if you admit that it's not concepts of non-recognitive psychological representations, then your reason for rejecting for claiming that these concepts are inadequate has got to be something other than claiming that you have this preconceptual intuition, because it seems that there is, you have to answer Kant's questions. How do you know? Okay. And it seems to me, I don't see how, Bergson or Deleuze get around this problem. Because I think that, experience, however you describe it, the kind of the qualitative particularities of experience, no matter how rich and complex and dynamic, do not kind of simply present themselves to the experiencer and deliver a criterion of adequacy that would allow you to kind of, to distinguish between adequate and inadequate concepts. So that's my attempt to, I don't know if I've really answered your question, but that's my attempt to respond.
Yes, you actually answered it perfectly. I have a further question, but I stop now because I think other people have questions. If it was any time, I would ask it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay. So should we continue with the previous question that you had?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you very much. I'm so lucky that nobody has something to say. Anyway, my further question is that if I understand you correctly, what you said just now, my further question is, what is the correlation? What is the supposed base for the correlation of our use of concepts and what is real, quote unquote, what is real? If I understand either Kant or Hegel or Deleuze or I don't know, even Frege correctly, or even Carnap, the way to point is to the relation of concepts, either particulars or classes of concepts, that must be according to, or must have some correlation with the relation that particularities or wholes of, again, quote unquote, real stands to each other. So if we have these parallelity between two principles of rule governing in nature or real or God or whatever, and principle of laws of thoughts in our thought, in these two parallel mapping, as if, of the concept. But in Deleuze's picture, what makes possible this unity of these, or this parallelity of these two principles of that I just named? What makes it possible is the plane of consistency, if I understand it correctly. Again, the plane of consistency is where there is no, as you put it perfectly, there's no corridor. You cannot actually transcend or descend from plane of consistency. Plane of consistency in a Platonic sense, as if we would have to arrive at it, something like that. This plane of consistency at the end is supposed to bring all the concepts of human and inhuman anything and real processes in the nature all together, if I understand again correctly. So at this point, something that they could say from, how could I say that there is a particular difference other outside of the conceptual difference, maybe is to point to morphological, you know something in chaotic theory and complex theory had a very strong effect. Morphological understanding, or as Dr. Martin Rosenberg put it, metaphors or linguistic tropes or things like these that are non-formal content, if that's the pragmatic of Deleuze and Guattari, non-formal content on unformed materiality. So it is as if they're trying to do this. But what I cannot understand, and I cannot, I didn't see, I haven't got an answer from what you just said. Maybe I just lost it. But what I cannot understand is then how could you in fact go beyond analytic truth? You know, what is analytic, what is logical truth and is obvious, and then the truths that we have about the world, what is not, are not in the abstract machine and given. What every human activity then would be meaningless or something like that. Was it clear, or was it just in the blue again? Sorry.
Okay, you need to help me a bit to kind of, so you said there's a, I think at one point, so you were asking about what the, you know, Deleuze and Guattari's kind of plane of consistency. And I think you were asking, or, you know, querying whether it's an attempt to coordinate, you know, the, I guess the subjective and the objective, or the, you know, the conceptual and the real. Is that what you were asking? Hello?
Sorry. Yes. Somehow, yes. So I'm really uncomfortable with the whole thing. I think I'm getting everybody bored, and nobody understand what I'm saying.
No,
so
no, it's
maybe just,
no. You said a lot, and no, you said
Yeah.
a lot, and what you said was, you know, was really, you know, you're trying to kind of say something difficult, you know, and complicated. No, so I want to respond, and well, look, I was going to say this is that precisely what they call the plane of consistency is not what, for instance, the subject-object identity or the point of indifference in Schelling, for instance. Okay, precisely because it's what you know, the plane of consistency is this kind of, you know, transversal diagonal, okay, that cuts through the strata. And that creates, you know, something new, you know, generates kind of, you know, ontological novelty. And it's precisely not this point of, you know, equilibrium or correspondence between the conceptual and the real. And in a way, what they're saying is that, you know, the correlation between, you know, the conceptual, the ideal, let's say the ideal and the real, is itself is guaranteed by stratification. Stratic synthesis is the condition for real synthesis, or, you know, the real synthesis, stratic synthesis is a condition for epistemological synthesis in the Kantian sense. So the point is that the opposition between the real and the ideal, or between the, you know, the conceptual and the objective, is a consequence of stratification or of stratic synthesis. And what they're trying to, you know, in a way, you know, the idealism, the kind of, you know, philosophical idealism would be an attempt to kind of to reconcile, you know, the ideal and the real, without asking about the conditions under, you know, under which this kind of disjunction is generated. And what they're doing is saying is that this opposition comes about through these processes of differentiation, which are themselves, you know, can't be, you know, I mean, they're real, but in a sense, they're real in a sense which it can't simply be juxtaposed to the ideal. Okay, so then, and that's why, as you know, I've been trying to insist, is that they don't start off. This is why they start, you know, they start in the middle. They don't start off by saying in the beginning was the full body, you know, the deterritorialized, you know, the full body without organs, and then stratification came. if that's what they were saying, it would be completely theological and idealist. What they're saying instead is that, we kind of, they want to kind of describe, they want to kind of, to think and produce the, the distinctions, whose, in a way, that can be, whose diagonalization or whose traversal produces the unrepresentable, the kind of, the becoming, the movement of becoming that they're interested in, The point is that becoming is, if you start with becoming, you're still in the ambit of representation. And I think that the plane of consistency is the movement of becoming, but it has to be, constructed, and it has to be constructed by understanding that everything is kind of, is locked in between, identity and difference, or, becoming and unbecoming, or stability and disorder. So in that sense, what's striking is that although they're often criticized for thinking, for having a kind of, for regenerating a dualism, I think a careful reading shows that they're very careful about each, kind of contrast, or kind of, opposite, so-called opposition, is simply kind of generated to produce the moment of its traversal, okay, or of its diagonalization. And that's why, it's almost as if they want to say that the kind of, it's only by, undoing, you kind of, you orchestrate these distinctions and these oppositions in such a way as to allow them to generate their own undoing, okay, their own kind of, their own undoing, but in a positive sense, in a way, because what lies beyond them isn't simply this ineffable kind of transcendence, it's this positively characterizable, movement, which, they tell you a lot about. So, okay, I don't know if
I have a question, real quick.
Yes.
On intuition, Deleuze and Guattari, Earth metaphysics aside, what forms of intuition would be valid to you? Like, just, independent of Deleuze and Guattari, like in a Kantian sense, what forms of intuition would be valid to you?
Well, okay, here, I think, there is a kind of form of conceptual intuition, in a way, a kind of, there is, an apprehension of particulars, of concretely determined particulars, but this is still, it still involves conceptual mediation. This is just following Sellers here, like this. So there's an intuition of a this such, which can then be predicatively characterized. But I think that, I think that the kind of, there is, the distinction between intuition and judgment holds that obviously we're not always judging, we have, not every kind of component of our experience is a product of judgment. There has to be something about which to judge, something to kind of, to predicatively characterize. So there is an intuition, but it's a conceptual intuition. It's a this such, in this kind of Aristotelian sense, which is already formed, conceptually formed, and which can then be further, propositionally determined. And okay, I know that, like, with German idealism, there's a complicated, there is a kind of, I don't know, in Fichte and Schelling, there's a kind of a defense of intellectual intuition. So it's possible that I'm too Kantian. So yeah, it's maybe there is a version of intellectual intuition that is kind of that can be defended against these Kantian objections. I'm just not familiar enough with it, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
I could ask a question, but you know, I don't want to drag us too far off topic, because I wanted to ask Ray about sort of the epistemic reading of the commodity form that we were talking about in Marx as a possible alternative to this sort of plane of immanence. Ray, do you think this is the right time to ask a question like that? Would you be interested in taking it, or?
Sure. Okay. I'm gonna have to go soon. I can take. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess so. Last time we talked about this, and I raised the issue of Sohn-Rethel's work as a possible way of maybe avoiding, a kind of relapse into a more traditional sort of Kantian posture, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how we attempt to safeguard ourselves, right? From this sort of ontological adventurism, if you will. And we didn't engage in a long conversation about it, but I think what you did say was that you were a little bit conscious of the way that Sohn-Rethel potentially, because we were talking about a book by Alfred Sohn-Rethel, Intellectual and Manual Labor, how he reifies certain categories which are more specific to the context of capitalism, right? Like the category of labor, how his sort of trans-historical use of the exchange analysis in order to explain dualism isn't adequate, right? Because of that. But one thing I didn't get to say last time, I guess, is that, I think one thing about that is that it's dependent on quite a specific sort of value form reading of Marx, right? That you find in like the work of, Robert Kurz or Moishe Postone or people like that, which is this idea that, I guess what Postone calls I think it's the social form of or the commodity form of social production. It's this idea that it kind of emerges like dunku, right? That you have capitalism, which comes about or begins to be generated in the late Middle Ages, and there's no change in the domain of production or no significant effect really that's exerted by the commodity form in the field of social reality prior to that. But what's interesting is that I think this actually goes against the grain of a lot of what Marx actually writes, right? When he talks about the emergence of, subsequent historical modes of production. Even when he talks about, absolute surplus value being the goal within the context of the early stage of capitalism, he points out that, this is just a radicalization of a tendency towards, the appropriation of, time as social surplus product, which was already very much there, right, in earlier modes of production. So I guess I think there are problems for sure with Sohn-Rethel's reification of the category of labor. And I don't think you can take this idea of the labor synthesis and say, well, we just have to, get to this physical world in which we understand that everything's kind of produced by humans in this immediate way. I don't think that's an adequate solution. But I do think that there's the possibility of trying to understand, kind of the phenomenon of dualism, or the phenomenon of what Sohn-Rethel calls non-empirical abstraction, through adopting a more developmental view of how the
Mhm.
commodity form proceeds. So I just wanted to ask you, I mean, do you think that that could be a possible, like, because again, my concern sort of is that I think that when you kind of make the human and its finitude sort of the center, right, of your project in a way, and we were talking before about Nigristani inhumanism and so forth, which is against anti-humanism, that position itself, I think, potentially reifies certain social categories which are far more specific to modernity than the commodity form itself, right? You know, if you look at sort of like the Cartesian turn, if you look at you know, kind of this evolution, you know, hypokemenon, you know, subject, subjectum, and how all this develops. I mean, do you think that's possible, that it'd be a valid philosophical approach to try to pursue that kind of analysis?
You mean a more developmental account of the genesis of the role of commodity exchange in generating real abstraction?
Yeah, like a more broadly historical. Like if you adopt the developmental role, do you think that could be used to explain, you know, again, kind of dualism, what Son Rethel refers to as non-empirical abstraction and so forth?
Well, look, I mean, you know, it's a difficult question, but, you know, Marx, you know, this famous line of Marx, you know, kind of, you know, the anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape, is precisely to say that, I mean, I take that to mean that, you know, it's only from within the ambit of our, you know, of the capitalist mode of production, that we can, you know, try to kind of, you know, retroject the conditions of its development. Okay, the mistake would be to think that it's possible to generate a developmental narrative about the evolution of modes of productions and of the, you know, basic categories concomitant with these different modes of production, and then show how they kind of, you know, they somehow culminate in capital and in the, you know, the social forms proper to capitalism. That would be, yeah, that it seems to me that that's precisely what Marx rejects, because he says, in a way, that that's exactly what classical political economy does. It doesn't understand how categories like production, labor, wealth, etc., are, you know, generated, you know, through the self-consciousness of a historically specific, you know, mode of production, and you cannot simply kind of, you know, project them back onto, you know, pre-capitalist modes of production, you know, in this, as if they were always there, as if every mode of production has these, can be understood in terms of these invariant, you know, features or categories. But nevertheless, he says we can talk about something like, you know, we can talk about production. He says, you know, there's no such thing as production in general, but we can, you know, come up with a viable category of production, because our whole kind of society, you know, is coordinated around commodity production, and then try to kind of to see, you know, to kind of to chart the extent to which this social category, this historically specific social category, was, you know, incompletely or, you know, partly, you know, kind of operative in these, you know, pre-capitalist formations. So I think so I think Marx, you know, the historicity or historical consciousness is to be aware that obviously capital is a contingent result, you know, of a long kind of historical process of you know, of transformation, and we have to try to understand this process without, eternalizing, the categories that are really kind of, specific to capitalism. And I think so that's the challenge. That's what Marx does. He tries to kind of, show how, in a way, I mean, it's, that famous kind of, the introduction to the Grundrisse, this kind of, the method of political economy, when he says that it's in a more kind of concretely different, no, I'm paraphrasing, but, a more concretely differentiated kind of society. So labor, for instance, labor becomes this common feature of a vast array of distinct human activities in a society like ours, which is more differentiated and has a greater degree of complexity than previous societies. But nevertheless, we can still use this category to understand pre-capitalist societies, so long as we don't think that they were all coordinated around labor. Okay. In other words, like, for instance, like if you think about the distinction between concrete and abstract labor, it's striking that it's only in our society that's these otherwise incommensurable types of activities, types of human activities, can all count as forms of labor. They can all be subsumed under this general category of labor. Okay, things that from programming, writing software, to to kind of to coal mining. Okay, what does software programming and coal mining or metalwork have in common in terms of their you could say that, well, they're both simply to say that they're kind of exerting kind of physical and cognitive capacities is kind of too general. I mean, it's there's no reason. It's like saying that by that count, like a zebra and a molecule could be kind of commensurated. It seems a completely abstract standard of commensuration. But the fact that all these qualitatively disparate types of activities can be counted as instances of labor shows, the kind of, the actuality of abstract labor as a category. So that even before the instantiation of abstract labor, human beings did things, okay, tanning, weaving, navigating, et cetera, et cetera. You could list all the kind of the activities that human beings were engaged in, but only, a relatively small subset of them would have counted as labor within that society, okay? And that's the point I think that Marx is making. So it's a mistake to think that even, that concrete labor, the category of concrete labor, that all these qualitatively distinct human activities were all already forms of concrete labor. That's the kind of the ahistorical error that Marx is kind of, I think rejecting. So, I don't want to, and perhaps I sounded too dismissive of, I'm still trying to figure out, I mean, I think Sonrettel's account is, brilliant, but I think there's a problem about saying that, the categories, that there's a kind of there's a set of categories of conceptual abstraction that are simply kind of, conditioned or determined by the exchange abstraction. It's just a bit, it seems a bit too simple. I mean, it's a complicated, I haven't figured out the answer. So I don't want to, I don't want to deny, I wouldn't go so far as, Posthuman would say, there's a sense in which, like, I'm not sure, but like, I've heard, there's even a sense in which you could say that the category of class is only peculiar to, historically specific to capitalism, Because if the capitalist class relation is a condition of originary accumulation and of, and then which is a valorization process, you could say that it's illegitimate, for instance, to say that class and class struggle was already kind of operative in pre-capitalist societies. But again, I think that's going too far. I mean, it's, if you can, actually, there's a really good paper by on this about the difference between caste and class, and how important it is to kind of to distinguish between these. You could say that the kind of the Marxian category of class as a structural category, emerges, is kind of already kind of allows us to understand retrospectively the dynamics of caste in pre-capitalist societies. But it's a mistake to to kind of to elide the distinction between them. In other words, you don't want to say there was no class struggle before capitalism. You want to say that there were like antagonisms of there was a social stratification, not in a Deleuzian sense, but there were these antagonisms of caste, okay, which then kind of prefigure the radical kind of the class antagonism in capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think also I should just add quickly to that. I mean, when you're talking about if I can, when you're talking about the subsumption of different forms of labor, let's say, under the sort of the rubric of exchange, it's very interesting because, of course, as we know today, most, and of course we can use the term labor in different senses, right? But most labor isn't necessarily labor that's being performed for value. Right, so that shows you how highly equivocal the commodity form is in terms of its operation. It's not like, if you look at what's called sort of unwaged labor, right, or socially reproductive labor, it shows you how highly equivocal the commodity form is, as a general process, in that we can't just juxtapose a domain, of today in which everything is subsumed, with a state in the past in which, far fewer things were subsumed. And in fact, we would have to say that, and Jason Moore and others have went further in this direction, that there's a necessary relationship between exchange and use value, whereby use value in a certain way has to remain use value, or there has to be a domain of use or excrescence for capitalism, or for capital to draw freely from, right? Like to give an archetypal example, like nature is something that is not commodified, right? So, you have people who are kind of reformists on this issue who will say, well, we have to commodify nature, right? But it also seems clear that if capitalism really had to pay, if capitalism really had to pay for the costs of natural appropriation, that it probably wouldn't be very functional as a system. One other small note I just want to add is that in Sonrethel's presentation, I think one risk is that early on in intellectual and manual labor, he lays out sort of what he perceives as being the relationship between the exchange analysis or the exchange abstraction and Kant's categories a priori, right? Which leads, I think, many people when they read the book to think, oh, well, he's just saying that the exchange abstraction arrives and these categories are embedded within it. I think the process is a little bit more like actually the one of retroaction that you're describing, which is characteristic of Marx, in the sense that throughout the book, he chronicles how the exchange abstraction develops historically, right? How it sort of collapses in the Middle Ages and is revived, in quite a radical sense, after the foundation of the Borgs and with capitalism. And I think in a way, he sees Kant's categories a priori, or what he thinks of as the epistemologization of the commodity form, as being the consequence of this whole historical process. Right? Or insofar as those traits were perhaps latent in it in some way, that they did not, that this historical process was absolutely necessary for that articulation to occur so that they could be seen retrospectively, right? So I'm not saying you're wrong, in terms of how you present that. I just think it's quite, even in Sonrethel's account, I think that's quite nuanced as well.
Thanks. No, that's very helpful. Yeah, no, I need to, as I say, I don't have a kind of, a ready-made kind of response. So no, I need to, what you said is actually very helpful. But I'm afraid, yeah, I'm going to have to go now. I'm sorry. I have to call it a day. What I propose is that I'll try to respond to the other questions in the comments next week, perhaps, if we can copy the.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Ray. This was a really great talk. Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming today and for your questions and comments.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, sepideh.
Thanks again. Thanks again. Thanks, sepideh. Thanks.
Sure. So looking forward to next week's session, which is titled Human from Subversion to Compulsion. Hope to see you there. All right.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Ray.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.